Chapter 98 to 105. By the time Amelia Bones returned after tracking down Trelawney, Fudge was already eager to leave and implement some of the new ideas he suddenly came up with by himself. Now that he knew he didn't even need the subjects of the prophecy to view the orb, it bothered him not at all when Bones reported that the batty divination professor had no clue of any augury she supposedly gave to Dumbledore. Chad had already suspected that she would have no idea about it, as the woman would have repeatedly bragged about it otherwise, and Dumbledore could not have that. This woman took great pleasure predicting people's death in each and every one of her classes, after all. Purely for clout. With Bones' news of a dead end in their investigation, Fudge, almost giddy with the desire to leave, used it as the perfect excuse to be on their way. He thanked Harry Potter for his time as he disappeared in a flash of flame with a confused Amelia, after practically impelling her through the Flu network. Chad could only sigh at the future drama this event would cause. He preferred to work from the shadows and strike at unaware targets, not act publicly for everyone to watch and take note. This was how he had accomplished so much without being challenged at every turn. Australia was the perfect example of what happened when someone tries to do things out in the open. It forces everyone affected by your decisions to defend their own interests, and thus, oppose you. Too many times, in either fiction or non-fiction, was this exposed as the natural laws of the universe. Humanity was selfish, and if someone bit off more than they could chew, they would be *tch slapped back into place by those affected. And even though Chad had managed to muddy his involvement with the prophecy by refusing to pick up the orb and confirm his association, the public would speculate. Especially now with Fudge on the warpath and Trelawney was aware she wasn't a complete hack. Dumbledore's prophecy that he used to lead Voldemort around like an idiot would be spread throughout the community before the end of the week. Chad was unsure if it was actually real or not since it was way too convenient. An experienced Dark Lord against a schoolboy with prank spells would never work, and only someone set up to fail would ever be trained how Harry Potter was. If you want someone to survive and fulfill a prophecy, you don't lock them in a cupboard for 10 years and then teach them school-level spells. But it mattered little at this point. Voldemort only existed as a Horcrux in the Lestrange Vault, and Chad held the only people that could access it. He was not worried about the resurrected Dark Lord that would suddenly focus all of his energy trying to kill him because of it. What did annoy him though, was that it would bring more attention, from both the media and the loyal Death Eaters still running around free. Maybe he could sacrifice Neville to the populace that would be searching for someone else to worship before they inevitably turned on them. Other than being marked by Voldemort, he did fit the other criteria. But to be honest, so did a lot of people if you squinted hard enough when reading the Poem of Vagueness. There was no mention of which year the person must be born, nor the Dark Lord in question. For all Chad knew, if Dumbledore didn't make it all up, then it could possibly be about him. Trelawney was sitting right in front of him. Dark Lord Dumbles was most likely the trigger to her prophetic episode. That was the problem with prophecies, the interpretation would never be clear and could be forced to suit any scenario. Born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies. And the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, but he will have power the Dark Lord knows not. And either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. Because of Horcruxes and Harry Potter's parasite, not to mention his scar, it was often immediately attributed to him. But nowhere in the text did this give specifics, answers, or confirmation. One way to look at it, if you chose to view it as about Harry Potter, was that his parents disobeyed Dumbledore's orders 3 times and Harry would have to kill Dumbledore if he ever wished to be free of his manipulations. After all, Dumbledore did way more harm to Harry Potter with his deliberate actions than Voldemort ever did. He had no idea what the power the Dark Lord knows not referred to. Other than it certainly wasn't love, that would be ridiculous. Still, Chad fully believed that the poorly written poem was contrived by Dumbledore to play Tom Riddle like a chump. Meeting Trelawney at the pub owned by his brother that hates him, when all other interviews are held at Hogwarts. Snape overhearing only the first sentence before running off to tell Voldemort. The most likely subjects of the prophecy being children of Dumbledore's burnt chicken lackeys. Sure sounded like fate loves Dumbledore and hates Tom and Harry. Still, after thinking about misdirecting the target of the prophecy onto Neville for a minute, he ended up deciding to just let everyone believe what they wanted without confirming anything. Although Neville had come a long way under his tutelage, the boy was not ready to be made the center of attention of the wizarding world. Plus his overbearing grandmother might start to cause problems. Of course, he would also be starting rumors that it was fake and merely a ploy by the power-hungry Dumbledore to regain his fame and influence. No point in not using the situation to his benefit. Glancing around at the McGonagall's modestly decorated office and finding nothing of interest, he decided to give the old woman her room back and head off to his own. He would need all the sleep he could get in the coming days of turmoil. Sure enough, the next day saw Trelawney strutting around like she was the best thing since sliced bread, and dropping hints at the power her third eye was capable of. Things only got worse a day later when the Daily Prophet came in the morning with news of Dumbledore's claims and Fudge adding more charges to the old man's rap sheet. While he was now gaining many new looks and whispered conversations from the students at Hogwarts, Fudge had done his best in separating him from any excessive involvement. Dumbledore claims to have not been involved in poor Harry Potter's kidnapping, yet then insists that there is a prophecy about he who must not be named's return, and he has known about it before his death. Personally, I think it is all made up for the old fool to try and save his own skin after being revealed as a crook. But if he insists it's real, it only further proves Dumbledore is guilty of a lot more than we first thought. Therefore, with the full support of the DMLE, if Dumbledore doesn't turn himself in by tomorrow at 6 p.m., all of his assets will be seized, and anyone found colluding with him guilty of accessory to his crimes. Furthermore, a reward of 50,000 galleons will be offered for any information leading to his arrest. The dining hall erupted into chaos when that bit of the article in the newspaper was read, as it would practically damn anyone still trying to stand up for Dumbledore. The dark faction of the Wixengamot would be out for blood with Fudge's declaration, since it was basically giving them free rein to hunt down their political enemies on the barest of suspicion they would be hiding the fugitive Albus Dumbledore. Though many of them were still confused why Voldemort had yet to show himself to his marked Death Eaters, they were practically creaming their pants with his brilliant destruction of their most hated and feared enemy. While the magical world was losing its mind, Chad was cursing his inability to control the situation. This was precisely what he didn't want to happen. R.O.B had given him only one objective, for Dumbledore to get his comeuppance. But since this was now his new life, he wanted to benefit from the power vacuum such a thing would create. However, Dumbledore had forced his hand, and now Fudge was off doing his best to see the old man destroyed. Sure, it was a good thing, as Chad would have to do it himself eventually anyway. But there would be so many missed opportunities and problems created from the rushed job, that he would rather Dumbledore had remained hidden for a few more years. Even if now he didn't actually have to lift a finger to see Dumbledore brought down by the masses, and could just sit back with a bag of popcorn to watch the show. Still, he wasn't going to complain too much about it. Things were otherwise going well in his conquest of both the mundane and magical world, and Britain was purely for his entertainment. He didn't actually need to take it over diplomatically. It was the equivalent to playing an RPG computer game, failing a dialogue choice and missing out on a piece of loot that would only be relevant for a couple of more levels before he outgrew it. What was Dumbledore and the British Ministry of Magic when he planned to enslave the entire world's magical population? Hell, the only country's magical community he was wary of was the Magical Congress of the United States of America. But that was only because they were so over-policed that exposure was higher if he came in enslaving people willy-nilly. For that reason, they would be left until last. What were they going to do against the rest of the world if it was under Chad's control? Even if the Muggles found out by that point, they would still be aligned against numerous enemy countries that had their leaders taking orders from his people. After all, most Muggle governments were aware of their magical counterparts. And if Chad took over the magical side that protected the Muggle government, how easy would it be to usurp them as well? The deadline for Dumbledore to turn himself in came and went with no response for the old man. Even his Order of the Phoenix lackeys did not appear to once again advocate his innocence, as doing so would only see them jailed for collusion. Chad never expecting Dumbledore to turn himself in, since the number of schemes the old man had spanned the wizarding world with would be easy to uncover, with the Minister for Magic using his influence to use harsher interrogating methods. A carefully worded oath swearing no involvement or the use of Veritaserum would undo the man as surely as being caught red-handed. With the massive political bloc now opposing the leader of the light, nearly any method would easily be able to be voted through and see the Dark Lord brought down. And without Fawkes to teleport to safety as he pleased, Dumbledore's escape capabilities had been severely limited. Which was why there was such a massive crackdown on any witch or wizard that would supply aid to Dumbledore, and a reward that would see even the Weasleys think twice about accepting it over their loyalty to the man. With Dumbles laying low, things seemed to quiet down except for the occasional raid on the more fanatical of his supporters like Diggle and the like. So much so that Chad hoped it would last a bit longer so he could at least finish school and reach adulthood. Being a teenager sucked when you had the mind of an adult and wished to be treated as such. 13-year-olds could not drink or do any of the fun stuff that he took for granted when he turned 18 in his past life. Well, at least openly. But most importantly, as a child, he would never be taken seriously or be able to run for office in the ministry. Not for the first time, he cursed R.O.B for making him Harry Potter instead of a random wizard that had already finished Hogwarts. He might have actually attended the Yule Ball if he was older, and even though a lot of the more senior years had their eyes on him thanks to his larger stature, looks, wealth and fame, he doubted they would treat him like anything other than his current age. Older kids tended to look down on their younger schoolmates, even if it was by only a year or two. Chad didn't bother attending the second task since he had no great desire to stare at the Black Lake until the contestants reappeared from rescuing their hostages. Really, with untold applications for magic, surely someone could have come up with a way to view the champions as they swam under the surface of the water. Predictably, Ron failed to come anything other than last, but he did surprise Chad by actually rescuing his hostage. The fact that his target was his sister Ginny spoke volumes of Ron's magnetic personality. The Triwizard Tournament organizers weren't exactly spoiled for choices when it came to selecting a hostage for the ostracized redhead since they couldn't exactly use his chessboard or food. Without the boy who lived by his side, and coupled with his radical stance of what was considered dark, the only thing magnetic about his personality was a magnet's repelling force when it came to his ability to drive people away. He was the polar opposite of the current political climate, and his inability to keep quiet on his personal views had nearly everyone distancing themselves from him. Still, even with Ron's magical aptitude and lack of friends, the boy somehow managed to struggle through the second task of the Triwizard Tournament. Chad suspected either outside interference or massive amounts of private tutoring. With Dumbledore forced to lay low until Voldemort revealed himself, things settled down to what was considered normal in magical Britain. Time flew by without incident until the third and final task of the tournament was only hours away. Though Chad had been wary of Dumbledore making a move while the tentative peace lasted, the final challenge of the competition filled him with anxiety. If ever there was a time for magical shenanigans that would disrupt his plans, this would be the time for it. A public event such as the conclusion of an international tournament would be the perfect time for making a move, using the public exposure to spread whatever message the Dark Lord wished. Also, Barty Jr. was still yet to make an appearance, and Chad wondered just how Dumbledore planned to make use of that crazy bastard without implicating himself. If Dumbledore had any sense, he would simply put the lunatic out of his misery. Still, Chad was worried Dumbledore would do something drastic. At this point, practically the whole wizarding world was against him other than a few die-hard loyalists, and he had been publicly branded as a criminal fugitive with a massive reward for any information leading to his capture. The only possible way Dumbledore could redeem his good name was if Voldemort waltzed into the ministry and started killing people while admitting to framing the old man. And although Chad had thrown around the idea of Voldemort resurrecting to increase his own fame, he sure as *T wasn't going to do it now that it would benefit Dumbledore. By the time the champions had entered the hedge maze to battle its trials, Chad must have checked the Marauders map 20 times looking for suspicious names. But so far, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. 40 minutes later, Victor Crumb suddenly appeared on the stage in front of the judges with the Triwizard Cup in his hands. The Durmstrang students went wild with cheers, and Chad quickly checked his map once again. Nothing. Was he perhaps overthinking the situation? Just because canon always had problems appear out of nowhere, didn't mean things would be the same now he had spectacularly changed the storyline. After thinking this, he allowed himself to relax, after he checked the map one last time and still found nothing. A smile erupted across his face when he realized Dumbledore had probably decided to go back to playing the long game and waiting for Voldemort to mess up on his own accord. Flitwick and Snape were sent off to retrieve the failed champions Miles Bletchley and Ron Weasley from the maze, and soon a short closing ceremony was held. Someone with a camera was snapping off pictures while Bagman was shaking hands of the winner from Durmstrang. Everything was going just how you would expect the conclusion of a school competition to go, even a magical one. Of course, that was when a spell was shot into the sky, and a giant menacing skull with a snake slithering around it came into being. Some idiot had used Morse Mordra spell, the signature move of the Death Eaters. For F***'s sake. Chad accidentally exclaimed aloud, his short-lived peace of mind destroyed at the sight of the creepy spell. Harry! Hermione exclaimed in shock, still obsessed about propriety no matter how much he had changed her original annoying personality. Not bothering to give her an excuse or an apology, Chad ignored her and watched as the crowd became panicked at the sight of the magical illusion. Chaos was only a step away, and the herd mentality of the crowd was just waiting for the first person to make a move so they could follow their lead, much like an army on the cusp of defeat when the first person flees for their life. It quickly turns into a rout. Thanks to the frightened minds of those seeing the first offender leg it, they would be quick to do so as well. It was the perfect moment to imprint the identity of those attacking in the subconscious of the crowd, even if it was untrue. Witnesses to a crime usually had problems accurately recollecting what they saw at the best of times, let alone in stressful situations. But once their opinion was formed, it rarely changed, even if all the facts are put in front of them to prove otherwise. Dumbledore is attacking. Run, his Death Eaters are here! Yelled the poor student that happened to make eye contact with Chad. It only took a split second for him to wandlessly cast legilimency on the unprotected mind of the closest student, and he had his leader of the sheep to control the momentum of those gathered. There was no way he was going to do it himself, that would put him under too much scrutiny and waste all of the effort he made staying off of Dumbledore's radar. Word would undoubtedly get back to the master manipulator if Harry Potter yelled out commands that would negatively impact him. Just like Chad predicted, the panicked sheep took the incentive to flee screaming. The threat of the most powerful wizard turned dark too much for their minds to handle. A few unfortunate people were trampled when they fell to the ground in the manic stampede, such was the chaos and danger of large numbers of people packed together. Those running for their life rarely stopped to help others. A small group of masked men in cloaks had emerged from the forbidden forest and started firing stunners at those closest to them just after everyone ran thinking Dumbledore was going to kill them. Even if he was the one behind the interruption to the festivities and had scripted this attack, Chad couldn't have timed it better than what had just occurred. Fear from the giant skull in the sky had overridden the crowd's rationality. Chad's unwitting patsy had yelled out Dumbledore as the culprit, and then these obviously fake Death Eaters started shooting stunners. If these were real Death Eaters, the streams of magic flying through the air would be green instead of red, and the victims would never wake no matter the counter curse or spell cast on them. Luckily, everyone hit by the stunners was at the edge of the mass of fleeing witches and wizards, and everyone was running away from the attackers. Those stunned were not trampled to death. But with such an uncontrolled exodus, there was bound to be many injuries. The deadline for Dumbledore to turn himself in came and went with no response for the old man. Even his Order of the Phoenix lackeys did not appear to once again advocate his innocence, as doing so would only see them jailed for collusion. Chad never expecting Dumbledore to turn himself in, since the number of schemes the old man had spanned the wizarding world with would be easy to uncover, with the Minister for Magic using his influence to use harsher interrogating methods. A carefully worded oath swearing no involvement or the use of Veritaserum would undo the man as surely as being caught red-handed. With the massive political bloc now opposing the leader of the light, nearly any method would easily be able to be voted through and see the Dark Lord brought down. And without Fawkes to teleport to safety as he pleased, Dumbledore's escape capabilities had been severely limited. Which was why there was such a massive crackdown on any witch or wizard that would supply aid to Dumbledore, and a reward that would see even the Weasleys think twice about accepting it over their loyalty to the man. With Dumbles laying low, things seemed to quiet down except for the occasional raid on the more fanatical of his supporters like Diggle and the like. So much so that Chad hoped it would last a bit longer so he could at least finish school and reach adulthood. Being a teenager sucked when you had the mind of an adult and wished to be treated as such. 13-year-olds could not drink or do any of the fun stuff that he took for granted when he turned 18 in his past life. Well, at least openly. But most importantly, as a child, he would never be taken seriously or be able to run for office in the ministry. Not for the first time, he cursed R.O.B for making him Harry Potter instead of a random wizard that had already finished Hogwarts. He might have actually attended the Yule Ball if he was older, and even though a lot of the more senior years had their eyes on him thanks to his larger stature, looks, wealth and fame, he doubted they would treat him like anything other than his current age. Older kids tended to look down on their younger schoolmates, even if it was by only a year or two. Chad didn't bother attending the second task since he had no great desire to stare at the Black Lake until the contestants reappeared from rescuing their hostages. Really, with untold applications for magic, surely someone could have come up with a way to view the champions as they swam under the surface of the water. Predictably, Ron failed to come anything other than last, but he did surprise Chad by actually rescuing his hostage. The fact that his target was his sister Ginny spoke volumes of Ron's magnetic personality. The Triwizard Tournament organizers weren't exactly spoiled for choices when it came to selecting a hostage for the ostracized redhead, since they couldn't exactly use his chessboard or food. Without the boy who lived by his side, and coupled with his radical stance of what was considered dark, the only thing magnetic about his personality was a magnet's repelling force when it came to his ability to drive people away. He was the polar opposite of the current political climate, and his inability to keep quiet on his personal views had nearly everyone distancing themselves from him. Still, even with Ron's magical aptitude and lack of friends, the boy somehow managed to struggle through the second task of the Triwizard Tournament. Chad suspected either outside interference or massive amounts of private tutoring. With Dumbledore forced to lay low until Voldemort revealed himself, things settled down to what was considered normal in magical Britain. Time flew by without incident until the third and final task of the tournament was only hours away. Though Chad had been wary of Dumbledore making a move while the tentative peace lasted, the final challenge of the competition filled him with anxiety. If ever there was a time for magical shenanigans that would disrupt his plans, this would be the time for it. A public event such as the conclusion of an international tournament would be the perfect time for making a move, using the public exposure to spread whatever message the Dark Lord wished. Also, Barty Jr. was still yet to make an appearance, and Chad wondered just how Dumbledore planned to make use of that crazy bastard without implicating himself. If Dumbledore had any sense, he would simply put the lunatic out of his misery. Still, Chad was worried Dumbledore would do something drastic. At this point, practically the whole wizarding world was against him other than a few die-hard loyalists, and he had been publicly branded as a criminal fugitive with a massive reward for any information leading to his capture. The only possible way Dumbledore could redeem his good name was if Voldemort waltzed into the ministry and started killing people while admitting to framing the old man. And although Chad had thrown around the idea of Voldemort resurrecting to increase his own fame, he sure as sh*t wasn't going to do it now that it would benefit Dumbledore. By the time the champions had entered the hedge maze to battle its trials, Chad must have checked the Marauders map 20 times looking for suspicious names. But so far, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. 40 minutes later, Victor Crumb suddenly appeared on the stage in front of the judges with the Triwizard Cup in his hands. The Durmstrang students went wild with cheers, and Chad quickly checked his map once again. Nothing. Was he perhaps overthinking the situation? Just because canon always had problems appear out of nowhere, didn't mean things would be the same now he had spectacularly changed the storyline. After thinking this, he allowed himself to relax, well, after he checked the map one last time and still found nothing. A smile erupted across his face when he realized Dumbledore had probably decided to go back to playing the long game and waiting for Voldemort to mess up on his own accord. Flitwick and Snape were sent off to retrieve the failed champions Miles Bletchley and Ron Weasley from the maze, and soon a short closing ceremony was held. Someone with a camera was snapping off pictures while Bagman was shaking hands of the winner from Durmstrang. Everything was going just how you would expect the conclusion of a school competition to go, even a magical one. Of course, that was when a spell was shot into the sky, and a giant menacing skull with a snake slithering around it came into being. Some idiot had used Morse Mordra spell, the signature move of the Death Eaters. For F***ck's sake. Chad accidentally exclaimed aloud, his short-lived peace of mind destroyed at the sight of the creepy spell. Harry! Hermione exclaimed in shock, still obsessed about propriety no matter how much he had changed her original annoying personality. Not bothering to give her an excuse or an apology, Chad ignored her and watched as the crowd became panicked at the sight of the magical illusion. Chaos was only a step away, and the herd mentality of the crowd was just waiting for the first person to make a move so they could follow their lead, much like an army on the cusp of defeat when the first person flees for their life. It quickly turns into a rout. Thanks to the frightened minds of those seeing the first offender leg it, they would be quick to do so as well. It was the perfect moment to imprint the identity of those attacking in the subconscious of the crowd, even if it was untrue. Witnesses to a crime usually had problems accurately recollecting what they saw at the best of times, let alone in stressful situations. But once their opinion was formed, it rarely changed, even if all the facts are put in front of them to prove otherwise. Dumbledore is attacking. Run, his Death Eaters are here! Yelled the poor student that happened to make eye contact with Chad. It only took a split second for him to wandlessly cast legilimency on the unprotected mind of the closest student, and he had his leader of the sheep to control the momentum of those gathered. There was no way he was going to do it himself, that would put him under too much scrutiny and waste all of the effort he made staying off of Dumbledore's radar. Word would undoubtedly get back to the master manipulator if Harry Potter yelled out commands that would negatively impact him. Just like Chad predicted, the panicked sheep took the incentive to flee screaming, the threat of the most powerful wizard turned dark too much for their minds to handle. A few unfortunate people were trampled when they fell to the ground in the manic stampede, such was the chaos and danger of large numbers of people packed together. Those running for their life rarely stopped to help others. A small group of masked men in cloaks had emerged from the Forbidden Forest and started firing stunners at those closest to them just after everyone ran thinking Dumbledore was going to kill them. Even if he was the one behind the interruption to the festivities and had scripted this attack, Chad couldn't have timed it better than what had just occurred. Fear from the giant skull in the sky had overridden the crowd's rationality. Chad's unwitting patsy had yelled out Dumbledore as the culprit, and then these obviously fake Death Eaters started shooting stunners. If these were real Death Eaters, the streams of magic flying through the air would be green instead of red, and the victims would never wake no matter the counter curse or spell cast on them. Luckily, everyone hit by the stunners was at the edge of the mass of fleeing witches and wizards, and everyone was running away from the attackers. Those stunned were not trampled to death. But with such an uncontrolled exodus, there was bound to be many injuries. Dumbledore betrays allies for clemency. Chad couldn't help but laugh out loud when he read the Daily Prophet the next morning. After Dumbledore's minions retreated, peace and order were quickly restored to the chaos that had spread through Hogwarts. Children were sent to bed after being reassured they were now safe, and Aurors appeared to patrol the school's grounds just to make sure. All in all, the students of Hogwarts were quick to fall back into their usual routine and perceived safe space. Hogwarts was the safest place in the world, after all. Which was weird for Chad, but considering that in canon this happened many times, he was not exactly surprised. How a mass attack of Dementors at a Quidditch game was so quickly forgotten showed just how different Magicals were from Muggles. While Chad had been writing to Rita with the details of what had transpired, he suddenly had an ingenious idea. A way to isolate Dumbledore from even his most staunch supporters. Well, at least all those not under some sort of mind control. One man against the world was not as big of a threat than if he has supporters. And what better way to isolate Dumbledore than for everyone to think he exposed the names of the Death Eaters that had viciously attacked the place that held everyone's heirs? How else would the Aurors know the identities of the masked men, unless Dumbledore himself had given them up? No one was going to trust or work for someone that would betray them so easily. A couple of people might say this was surely evidence that Dumbledore was not evil, but their opinion would be nearly as effective as a fart in the wind. The majority would see only betrayal or guilt. Chad was gaining a few queer looks for laughing so hard while reading the news, so he settled down and finished eating his breakfast. The public opinion of Dumbledore was so low that no matter what Chad did, it would never influence it positively. Especially since that would only be a problem if people connected the dots that Chad was involved in the man's downfall. Which, to be honest, would not be too hard to figure out considering Chad's relationship to Rita Skeeter and his past interactions with Dumbledore. Still, Chad looking like a crazy person was not ideal even if it didn't affect his plans. With Dumbledore's reputation in tatters, the only course of action left to take was to put him out of his misery. This was to prevent any extreme reactions that could endanger Chad or the Statute of Secrecy. Just like a crazy Voldemort doing something stupid to alert the Muggles, Dumbledore may decide he had nothing to lose by taking the entire magical population down with him. The only problem was how to draw out Dumbles and then kill him without taking the blame. While he was thoughtfully chewing on the last piece of his bacon, Lilith the bacon-addicted owl having eaten the rest, Chad was drawn out of his reverie by a group of Slytherins heading for the Gryffindor table. This was going to be interesting. I had always thought you nothing more than an idiot with no sense of restraint, Weasley. Just a loud mouth with eating habits like that of an animal, you seem to have no self-control. How wrong I was. To imagine that your idiot persona was just a front to hide the fact that you are dark and your dad's a Death Eater. Crowed Draco Malfoy with unrestrained glee while waving the Morning Prophet at the boy. That Draco was entirely too happy about the situation took most of the believability from the statement. Still, the damage was already done. Arthur Weasley had already been arrested by Aurors according to the Daily Prophet, and every student in the dining hall held a massive grudge against the family for frightening the sh*t out of them last night. Even though the article made no mention of a confession of guilt, the Weasley name was now viewed with hostility, as were the others involved. Wizard mentality may have overridden their judgment of security once the situation was over, but nobody forgot the humiliation from the experience of running scared. Especially when they now had a convenient scapegoat to release their anger and frustration on. Those that had been injured in the event even more so. Though luckily no one had died, there had been a historical consumption of skill grow with all the broken bones from being trampled. Meta-witches had been called in to help treat the many injured children, further exacerbating the negative opinion of the fake Death Eaters. Without Dumbledore coming forward and denying that he didn't betray his minions, they would think he was responsible for their capture. And Dumbledore, sure as sh*t, was not going to publicly admit he was the one that ordered them to attack Hogwarts. Even if it was to force Voldemort into the open. In everyone's mind, the only way Dumbledore could clear his name is if he went to an official hearing and made a magical oath on his innocence. Unless Dumbledore publicly swore on his magic, no one would believe anything he said. Even Veritaserum would not be enough to assure people anymore, as Rita Skeeter had cut that path off with mention on how Masters of Mind Magic could cheat the Truth Serum. He was damned if he did, and damned if he didn't. Ronald Weasley did not take Draco's accusation well, being called the very thing he was so radically against had short-circuited anything resembling logic in his brain. Instead of a calm measure reply, the red-headed boy launched himself off of the table he had just been sitting at and tackled Malfoy to the ground. Chad's mouth dropped open in surprise at the overreaction. He had thought Ron would at most resort to schoolyard taunts and insults. To see him maul a shrieking Malfoy like a rabid animal was epic in its scale of drama compared to what Chad was expecting. Unfortunately for Ronald, his initial momentum was quickly spent as the crowd of Slytherins backing Draco pulled him off and beat him like a red-headed stepchild. By the time the Gryffindor students grudgingly stepped in to help one of their own against Slytherin, Ron had many times the injuries of what he had managed to inflict on Malfoy. Only his brothers had been quick to jump in, but they were severely outnumbered. The teachers had also rushed over to intervene, but even though the scuffle had been relatively short, the damage inflicted was immense. The fact that purebloods had lowered themselves to fight like muggles was not lost on Chad. Draco looked like he was attacked by a cat, with significant bleeding scratches covering his face. But what drew Chad's morbid fascination was that Ron had managed to bite a chunk of Draco's cheek off in the fight. For all the times Chad had either publicly or silently belittled the boy for his eating habits, he had never thought Ron would turn to cannibalism. Once the teachers had finally separated the Slytherins and few Gryffindors that had stepped in, the broken body of a crying Weasley was revealed. They had really kicked the sh*t out of Ron without holding back. By the way his limbs were jutting out at odd angles, it was probably safe to say they were broken. The bone sticking out in some cases was also a bit of a giveaway. Hope they didn't use up all the skill grow, Chad thought to himself with a bit of gallows humor. The savagery had made him feel quite uncomfortable, the ruthlessness of everyone involved reminding him of the extremes people could go to when provoked. Even though Chad had overseen a war and experimented on criminals, he was never really engaged in a life-or-death situation up close. His mindset of striking from the shadows with overwhelming force had not prepared him for the brutality of getting up close and personal. Although he had been in a few punch-ups in his first life, they never left people with compound fractures. Still, while McGonagall was losing her sh*t at everyone involved, Chad quickly overcame any mental discomfort. He had seen thugs explode in a meaty shower of blood, a brawl that had gotten out of hand was not going to bother him for long. It was just a reminder that he was not the only person that was willing to cross the line to accomplish his goals. The number of eggs broken for his world domination omelet was going to be way more than the collateral damage of Draco and Ron. It did not escape him that he was mostly responsible for the current political climate. While not emotionally fragile enough to blame the entirety of the wizarding world's problems on himself, he was still adequately self-aware to realize he had amplified the consequences of the conflict with Dumbledore. But when it came down to suffering silently by himself while Dumbledore's schemes made the entire wizarding community take a massive sh*t on his chest, or making them share in the fallout from the old man's quest for fame and power, he was always going to pick the latter. He was no hero to suffer for everyone else's sins like Harry Potter. Chad was a selfish arsehole that took the world by its hair while he f***ed it for every opportunity that benefited him. The only thing that made him believe he was not evil was that he would cuddle it after he was finished. When the world was under his control, it would be a better place for the majority of people living in it with the changes he had already built the foundations for. Actually, maybe he was a bit more evil than he would like to admit. Oh well, not like I'm going to change. The world is full of tyrants, it might as well be me in charge instead of them. Chad thought to himself. The whole world domination and slavery thing had already made him scrutinize his beliefs and values closely. In the end, borderline evil or downright evil did not matter if he accepted himself and the choices he made. Slight moral dilemma over, Chad finished his breakfast and went about his day. When the school year ended, he had a lot to do. The fallout from Ron and Draco's fight gave the students of Hogwarts much to talk about until school ended. Even though the injuries suffered by the two boys were somewhat severe, because they were able to be quickly healed with magic, their punishment was not very harsh. Detention for a month or two when school resumed was a small price to pay for Ron biting a chunk of flesh from his hated rival's face. Draco pretty much got off scot-free, but his minions had detention until they left on the Hogwarts Express. Honestly, with lame-arse punishments like that for serious bodily harm, it was probably the reason why bullying was quite prominent within the halls of Hogwarts. What was the harm of giving children a slap on the wrist if injuries were easily fixed? Just a generation of spoilt bullies with reality-warping abilities to further their selfishness. With the focus on the upcoming trial for Daedalus Diggle, Alpheus Doge, Sturgis Podmore and Arthur Weasley, the wizarding community was rife with chatter. Unfortunately for those that the Aurors managed to capture, this was not a good thing. By drawing out the time before the trial, it gave the public the opportunity to whip themselves up into a frenzy and call for the death of those that dared to try and harm their children. With everyone asking for the death penalty, the members of the Wisengamot would be only too happy to comply for a boost in public opinion. The trial would be short, sweet, and rid them of Dumbledore's most loyal supporters anyway. As far as they were concerned, it was a win-win. Many were hoping that Dumbledore would show up to plead for lenience, but with the Daily Prophet slandering him as the one who betrayed them in the first place, they didn't hold their breath since they also believed it. Chad was still trying to think of a way to draw out Dumbledore and kill him. He supposed he could just throw caution to the wind and order the elves to attack him now that the old man was separated from any allies, but it wouldn't feel nearly as satisfying. He wanted Dumbledore to make a fool of himself and go down in history as a joke. If Chad was just a random wizard and unaffected by Dumbledore's schemes, he would grant the man a quiet death. But wasting his childhood at the Dursleys and making things hard for him at every turn demanded punishment. That was why he came up with an elaborate plan to kill Dumbledore publicly. Sure, it would be unnecessarily complicated, risky and probably not work, but it would be hilarious to watch and satisfying if by some miracle it actually worked. Chad could almost hear the collective sigh of frustration from the followers of the evil overlord list. He was surely breaking a few rules. But they just didn't understand the joy of humiliating your opponent before killing them. Of course, even though Chad was going to do something as stupid as playing with his prey, he was not retarded enough to do so by putting himself in the spotlight. It was time for Tom Marvolo Riddle to make an appearance at the Ministry of Magic and ally with them against Dumbledore. Poor Tom had been in hiding since the famed Leader of the Light used him as a scapegoat to start a war. Now that Dumbledore was exposed, it was only right that he come forward and help fight the Dark Lord. The sheep would eat it up, especially with Rita Skeeter pushing the narrative. The Wizarding World was the poster child for the success of propaganda, the magical world equivalent for CNN. Hell, Magical Britain was so used to believing everything they read in the Daily Prophet that they would probably vote for Biden if they printed he was not actually brain damaged. Creating a controllable Voldemort would not be too hard to set up. Luckily, even though Chad purged all of Voldemort's useless memories from his mind, he had left a backup holodisk for occasions such as this. But it would not really matter if he didn't, since there was still the Hufflepuff cup in Gringotts to pilfer for unfiltered memories of Riddle's life. All Chad had to do was pick a random Australian wizard that he didn't like, wipe his mind, make him look like an aged Tom Riddle before becoming a snake/human hybrid, and then fill his head with carefully edited memories. The man would think he was Tom Riddle that was on the run after Dumbledore framed him as a Dark Lord. With no other memories to contradict his story, both magical oaths and Veritaserum would make it seem like he was telling the truth. Because, to the new Tom Riddle, he would be. Of course, this would not stand up to anyone that knew legilimency, but since everyone was on a witch hunt for Dumbledore, no one would really look too closely when supplied with more proof of the man's guilt. Even if they did suspect Tom Riddle of something and checked his mind, Chad wouldn't care if the man was imprisoned or killed. He was just a throwaway pawn in the first place. The hard part would be persuading the Ministry to allow the new Tom, a poor orphan Muggleborn, to challenge Dumbledore to a public duel and have them not interfere. Though Chad thought they would change their minds with a healthy bribe of galleons and a chance to kill off their main problem. It wasn't like Dumbledore would show up for anything else, and they had already exhausted all other methods to find him. With Sirius giving Chad free rein to move about as he wished when home from school, it took him less than a week to create his very own Riddle minion. Sirius was a laid-back kind of guy with a need to please his godson, the only thing left of what he considered family. How Canon Harry Potter was okay with being locked up at the Dursleys, Chad would never know. Oh, wait, Dumbledore was manipulating everyone. How was Harry fine with living like a slave once he had magic? Chad corrected his inner monologue. As he gazed at the finished product of magical cosmetic surgery and brainwashing, he couldn't imagine a situation where he couldn't experiment with magic as he pleased. But now was the time to set his plans in motion, not imagine how things might have been if he was raised in captivity to be a sacrifice for the greater good by Dumbledore. Boppy. Chad called. Yes, master, said his most trusty head elf once he popped into existence. I need you to dress this man in green robes fit for a pure-blood Nobel, give him a pouch of galleons enough to bribe the Ministry of Magic, and then awaken him in Diagon Alley. Also, don't be seen, we don't want anyone to trace him back to us. Of course, master. The dutiful elf replied before disappearing with the new Tom Riddle. Now Chad just had to sit back and watch the fireworks happen. He had plenty of faith in Boppy to do as asked. The little bugger had been running all of Chad's house elf-related tasks for a few years now. No, he was worried about everything else that might go wrong. Once Tom woke up in Diagon Alley, he would wake up with but a single objective: to draw Dumbledore into a public duel and try to kill him. If Dumbles refused, then it would be just another insult to destroy whatever remained of his legacy. Being called a coward when he was supposedly this age's Merlin equivalent would do him no favors. Chad was also hoping the bait would be enough to draw the old man out. While Minion Tom would need to practice to work out the kinks of his new body, this could easily be explained by training for the duel. Chad had made sure he was capable of peak-level Voldemort skills, but Tom would need to be limited to borderline dark spells if he didn't want everyone to side with the leader of the light. Killing Dumbledore was only half of the goal. It was a slight gamble to equip his minion with a deadly arsenal of magic and fighting abilities, but when you had complete control of someone's mind, little was left to chance. Chad had literally built up Minion Tom's mind from scratch. After all, a code phrase or command was child's play. Of course, he wasn't stupid enough to teach his new killer mind arts that would be incredibly dangerous for everyone involved. An unleashed, new and improved Voldemort was not what Chad wanted running around destroying his plans. He only needed a single-use weapon that he could dispose of after it had done what it was created for. Later that night, Rita came home to 12 Grimmauld Place in barely restrained excitement, and Chad did his best to appear interested and shocked at all the right places. You will never believe what happened today. A man went to the Ministry of Magic and challenged Dumbledore to a public duel. And they allowed it. Rita burst out, unable to wait for a guess at her rhetorical question. Really, what's his name? Sirius asked his fiancée, intrigued about the man that had big enough balls to challenge such a powerful wizard. Tom Riddle. Never heard of him. Where's he from? Sirius questioned further. You wouldn't have, since he is a muggle-born that went to school in the 40s. Apparently. While Rita once again gushed about her latest scoop, Chad thought about how he was going to make the most of the situation. He doubted Dumbledore would actually be killed, but just seeing him fight would be extremely beneficial. He would just have to make sure he was not caught up in the danger and excitement when things inevitably went awry. The day of the scheduled duel between Tom Riddle and Albus Dumbledore had arrived. It was also not a coincidence that the trial for the Death Eaters from Hogwarts would take place afterwards. Since the public duel was a major attraction to the wizarding community, places with the space needed to hold such an event on short notice were limited. In the end, they decided to just build an arena at Hogsmeade. It was connected to the Floo system for those that couldn't apparate and had shops and pubs to accommodate the needed food and drinks. Not to mention, it was far from Muggles, and the revelry would go unnoticed. Although the Ministry had heard no word from Dumbledore about if he would actually show up, they proceeded as if he would. As much as Chad liked to sh*t on them for wizard stupidity, they were quite adept at seizing any anti-Dumbledore opportunity every chance they got. And a massive arena full of witches and wizards waiting eagerly to see a duel to the death would be very receptive to Ministry propaganda if Dumbles didn't show up. Sirius and Rita had been looking forward to today and had even accepted a box seat with the Ministry bigwigs. Not relishing spending the time waiting for the show to start by being brown-nosed by officials, he had begged Sirius to cast the disillusionment charm on him. This was so he could look around Hogsmeade and have an excuse if anyone discovered him while he was invisible. Sirius, being a prankster with a soft spot for mischief, agreed quickly without much thought, merely make sure to be back before the duel starts. Once free from prying eyes, Chad slipped on the cloak of invisibility he had liberated from Dumbledore just to be a little more confident he wouldn't be interrupted on his walk. While his fame didn't cause everyone to lose their mind anymore, the BWL title still drew attention. The small magical town was fun to explore for a while because of its quirks, but it soon started to lose its charm. Just as he was finished examining Madame Rosmerta's assets. The Three Broomsticks pub, the fireplace lit up for the umpteenth time and ejected a steady stream of redheads. Don't forget to be on your best behavior, young man, or I will give you a hiding you will never forget. Remember why we are here, we need to speak to Dumbledore. Declared the red-faced with hair to match matriarch of Clan Weasley. Yes, Mum, came the sullen response from Ron. For the life of him, Chad could not understand why Molly continued to yell things out in public. It was like she wanted the world to know her every thought. And her affection for howlers. Briefly making eye contact with the idiot child that was bashed in nearly every fanfiction written, Chad had a devilish smile on his face. Ron stiffened slightly and then looked around as if searching for a ghost that had given him a sudden chill down his back. Is this the fabled instincts of a wild animal? Chad thought to himself as he backed away and made his way back to where Sirius was. He didn't want Ron leaping at him and biting his face off like what happened to poor Draco. That was scary in more ways than one, even if he was confident in destroying the boy with little to no effort. It was pretty good timing anyway, since if the Weasleys had turned up, then it was a good indicator of the time because they were always late for whatever event they were going to. Getting close to midday, the time selected for the duel to start, the makeshift arena was filling up rapidly with excited magical folk. Even though Tom Riddle was an unknown, the anti-Dumbledore sentiment was high enough that he was the favorite to win even though he was heavily regarded as the underdog. Say what you want about Dumbledore's motives or nature, the man was still considered one of, if not the most powerful wizard in the world. For a man that nobody has ever heard of to show up and battle Dumbledore was worthy of respect, even if everyone thought he would die. Just before the clock struck 12, Cornelius Fudge made his way out to the middle of the arena for a bit of publicity. Re-election was coming up, and this was an opportunity too good to miss. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you all for coming today to see something that will go down in history as one of the greatest magical duels the world has ever seen. The Ministry of Magic is here to serve the people, and when one of our citizens enacts his right for a duel to settle personal wrongs against him, we could only oblige. Even though Albus Dumbledore is a wanted criminal. For this reason, we have made it clear that Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore has 12 hours of grace while we halt our manhunt of him for the many crimes he is guilty of committing against our community. Hopefully, his evil reign of terror will end today. This is at the behest of Tom Marvolo Riddle, grievously wronged when he found out Dumbledore's true nature as one of the evilest and vile Dark Lords in history when he was but a child at Hogwarts. He has been in hiding since 1945, fearing for his life while the world thought the leader of the light was a righteous man, not a beast in the guise of a human. We can only hope that Albus still has enough common decency to face his crimes head-on and answer this man's courageous challenge. For even though the result will not absolve Dumbledore of the crimes committed against the Ministry of Magic, it is the only chance Tom Riddle will have to gain closure. The trial for Dumbledore's loyal followers that he betrayed for the chance of absolving his many crimes will also be held after this event. And since we have agreed to 12 hours of peace, he will have the opportunity to speak on their behalf if he so wishes. Now, without further ado, it is time for what we are all gathered here to witness. The duel between Tom Riddle and Albus Dumbledore, if he even shows up. Finished Fudge, the sonorous charm amplifying his voice so that everyone could clearly hear him besmirch Dumbledore. While the crowd was chattering excitedly about Fudge's speech, Tom walked out to the arena to wait for his opponent's arrival. The minister even made a point to shake Tom's hand and thank him for his bravery and help in fighting for justice as they passed each other. Of course, it was loud enough for a few people to overhear it and spread it through the gathered masses, a masterful performance. If nothing else, Fudge was great at swaying public opinion. He needed to be to get elected in the first place when he was middling at best as a wizard. Time slowly ticked by as the man that thought he was Tom Riddle waited in the center of the arena for Dumbledore to show up, and soon half an hour had passed. The old man's penchant for arriving late to every important event was once again in full force. Though in this situation Chad could hardly fault him. Even General Akbar would believe this a trap, and he didn't see anything coming until it was firing at him. The crowd was slowly becoming belligerent as they sat around waiting for Dumbledore to turn up so they could watch someone die. At this rate, if he didn't appear soon, he would have lost any chance to regain some of his past glory and worship. Suddenly, as the crowd was cursing Dumbledore's lineage, the man himself appeared out of nowhere 30 meters away from Riddle. He must have been scoping out the arena for danger before operating directly into the dueling field. Teleportation was too overpowered. Immediately, the crowd seconds away from rebellion roared in approval, and they sat back satisfied they hadn't wasted their time. Riddle was quick to seize the chance to set the narrative and barked out a few damning words before Dumbledore could do so. Dark Lord Dumbledore. Today is the day you are brought to justice for stealing my life from me. He yelled, his voice magically amplified so the crowd could hear him easily. Now Tom, we both know it was your own choices that. Dumbledore tried to respond with his own sonorous charm active before Riddle cut him off. Liar. I was just a child, and you tried to mold me into a monster so you could be the hero that slays it, just like you did to Grindelwald. Even when I ran away, you created a villain to terrorize magical Britain in my... Ridiculous. You are Lord Voldemort, and you will die for the pain you brought. F***ck you old man, you are Lord Voldemort. And after Tom's last interruption, he followed his words with a silent Bombarda Maxima charm. This was never going to be a platform for Dumbledore to clear his name, well, unless he won. Dumbledore easily reflected the spell back at Tom when his wand magically appeared in his hand and followed it up by transfiguring 2 dogs to life. The Elder Wand was keen for battle. Sidestepping the returned Bombarda Maxima, Riddle shot out 3 cutting charms at different angles before turning his attention to the now lifelike hounds leaping at him with slobbering maws. Protego! He shouted as he slashed his wand, and a shield charm came into existence in front of him. Another wave of his wand had the shield explode into a concussive blast that destroyed the 2 dogs when they made contact with the magical protection, their rocky remains sent flying back towards Dumbledore. On and on the magical spell slinging went with intense fury, neither party gaining the upper hand. For a man over 100 years old, Dumbledore moved like a someone in his prime, probably because of a ritual he preached against. But even he knew it couldn't last. 15 minutes of constant dodging and casting saw him no closer to ending the man he thought was the Voldemort he created, assuming that the Philosopher's Stone had given him a new body. Knowing he couldn't compete with the fitness level of a new and improved Riddle, he stepped up his attacks. Transfiguration was Dumbledore's main bag of tricks, but it was not the only thing he knew. He had hoarded an entire generation of magical knowledge since he had taken over Hogwarts, and his spell repertoire was extensive. Conjuring a flock of sword-beaked birds to keep Tom busy, Dumbledore launched into a chant of an unfamiliar language while wildly gesturing with his wand. Damashida Dab, Fulcanaha Carax. With a victorious smile on his face, Dumbledore pointed the famed death stick at Tom just as he had annihilated the last conjured bird. When the ground started rumbling, everyone knew some cool *T was about to happen. Chad had a sudden feeling that it was nearly time to leave. While everyone was on the edge of their seats, keen to see what magical marvel Dumbledore had conjured, Chad stepped close to Rita and Sirius. At the slightest hint at danger to their lives, he was ready to activate an illegal portkey to take them to safety. He had already warned Hermione and Neville of the dangers and had a house elf watching them in case they got into trouble. Dumbledore was feared for a reason. Even though he was spouted *T about love and peace, the man was incredibly talented and dangerous. It was merely a cover after all. As everyone looked down at the arena to see why the ground was rumbling, Tom launched into the air with his self-created flight spell. The appropriate oohs and ahs at his skill only made them inch more and more off of their seats for a better look. Sitting on the edge of your seat was a weird phenomenon. An unconscious movement that literally had no effect on your eyesight, yet was nearly universally done by all people. Just as Riddle cleared 10 meters, the earth opened up, and a jet of lava shot into the air. Dumbledore had created a mini volcano, and it seemed to somehow aim itself at its selected target. The surprise of the spell took Tom a second to adjust his flight, but it was enough time to cover one of his feet in fiery goo. With a determination that seemed to shrug off any pain, Tom cut off the affected limb and continued to fly through the air dodging Dumbledore's hail of spells. It was a good thing that Chad had thoroughly modified his minion's body, or the pain from having your foot melted off would have ended the fight as surely as if he was hit by the killing curse. Dumbledore, a veteran fighter, would not have missed such an opportunity to finish him off. The programming of Minion Voldemort kicked in, and just like Dumbledore, his offensive was stepped up a level. He fired off a volley of offensive spells that forced the old man to take cover under a dome of protective magic. It was much harder to defend from air-to-surface attacks than vice versa, especially when liquid-hot magma was flooding the arena. However, while Tom was quickly giving himself a new silvery appendage, the Master of Transfiguration created more allies to help him attack. Creatures capable of flight launched out of the growing pool of fiery death and locked onto their target with unerring accuracy. The now recovered Riddle knew he had to pull out the big guns and resort to a spell that was as far dark as he was allowed to go. The protective dark charm Protego Diabolica was remarkably similar in its effects to Fiendfire, but not actually illegal. It allowed the user to create a protective ring of black fire around them that completely incinerated the enemies of the caster that came into contact with it while leaving their allies unharmed. Even other creations of fire. As Dumbledore's magma critters returned to their base form, they had the unintended consequence of falling back towards their creator thanks to gravity. A rudimentary air spell hastening its descent towards Dumbledore. Halfway through another spell, because he thought Voldemort would take a few seconds longer to defeat them, Dumbledore slightly panicked and cast a spell with an element his brain automatically told him subdued fire. A jet of water thanks to the Aguamenti charm. Unfortunately, the byproduct of fire and water was steam, and due to the close proximity of the molten earth, Dumbledore received a faceful of it. The old man screamed as the skin blistered worse than if he was hit with boiling water. Luckily, Although the steam caused immense pain to Dark Lord Dumbledore, it also saved him by creating a massive fog of war, obstructing the battlefield. Tom was forced to waste valuable time by casting spells to clear his view in between firing random potshots at Dumbledore's last position. However, in his eagerness to capitalize on his advantage, Tom had made himself a clear target for retaliation. Just as the cloud of steam cleared, it revealed his own position and a severely burned Dumbledore benefited from the mistake. A barrage of sword-beaked birds, followed by all manner of quickly fired lethal spells, exploded against Riddle's hastily erected shield. Though he didn't receive any life-threatening damage, it was enough to disrupt his flight and make him fall from the sky, his concentration on the spell lost. Dumbledore let out a shout of triumph, the pain of moving his blistered face momentarily forgotten in his joy at gaining the upper hand in a life-or-death fight. But there was one thing Albus Dumbledore didn't count on. The Tom Riddle he knew was a self-serving egomaniac that valued his own life above all else, even going so far as to make an anagram of his name to mean, flight from death, in French. So when Dumbledore expected to quickly finish the injured man falling from above as he tried to save himself, it took him by complete surprise when Voldemort accelerated his fall and was coming right for him. The spells had not stopped flying while Tom fell or Dumbles celebrated, such was the skill and determination of the combatants. But the slight miscalculation on Dumbledore's part of his enemy's motivations cost him another injury. Even as the man believed to be Tom Riddle was impaled, burnt, and then exploded into meaty chunks, his willingness to sacrifice his life to take Dumbledore with him cost the old man his wand arm. For once, the crowd baying in excitement was quiet. The savage fury of the duel making even the most veteran fighters amazed at the skill displayed in the fight, and the resolution of the sudden outcome. Tom Riddle was dead, and Albus Dumbledore left severely burned and missing an arm. The aura surrounding the arena and keeping the spells from impacting the crowd started to do away with the lava still flooding it, the mini volcano still slowly trickling out fiery death. Like a wounded animal, Dumbledore was extremely cautious and kept a keen eye on them for treachery. He wanted nothing more than to apparate back to his hideout and tend to his wounds. But this was the only chance he would ever get to plead his case. Luckily for Dumbledore, as much as Fudge wanted to finish the old bastard off, the damage his reputation would take was simply not worth it, and the Aurors were strictly instructed not to make a move on him. Seeing a gaggle of redheads hurrying over through the mostly cleared battlefield also helped to put Dumbledore's mind at ease. If ever there was a family entirely devoted to him, it was the Weasleys. Though why Molly decided to bring her children along with her was a bit baffling. This was a fight to the death, and a mutilated body was not far from where he stood. Albus. Thank Merlin you are okay. Molly cried out as she started to fuss over him and help with his wounds as much as she could. Thank you, Molly, it was a bit touch and go for a bit, but thankfully, justice prevailed. He managed to say through the pain, the adrenaline starting to wear off. Will you still be able to speak for Arthur and the others at the trial? To clear their names? She asked fearfully, afraid her last hope might abandon her. Of course, I will do my best. Unfortunately, I have lost a lot of my influence lately, let's hope this duel provides us with some more clout. But they're innocent, they were just acting on your orders. Right? Ron obliviously blurted out, unaware such a statement could add to Dumbledore's crimes. There, my boy. Have no fear, we will straighten this misunderstanding out. Dumbledore responded, trying to placate the idiot. But they want to give Dad the Dementor's kiss. You have to save him. Ron continued. As much of a git as Ron was, he did still care for his family. A flash of annoyance lit Dumbledore's features that could have been mistaken for a twinge of pain as he turned his back on the annoying child. But Ron was already at boiling point and took it personally. This was the man that caused his family every problem they were currently facing. While Molly started screeching at Ron to show respect to the great Albus Dumbledore, Ron's mind was flashing through all the **T he had to deal with since Dumbledore had come into his life. The rejection from Harry Potter, even though Dumbledore assured him that they would be friends. All of the hate him and his family received for sticking up for Dumbledore after his fall from grace. That his father was about to be killed for following Dumbledore's orders. The hate he felt for this crispy old cripple was more than he had ever felt for anything in his entire short life. Almost as if something was amplifying it. Before Ron could think things through or soothe his anger, he lashed out, almost automatically. Avada Kedavra. Holy **T. Chad couldn't help but exclaim out loud, he was in shock that his backup plan had actually worked. He was sure that Dumbledore would be able to defend himself against a child, especially one at Ron's level of skill. The fight with Minion Riddle must have taken more out of him than he thought. When Chad had run into the Weasley family, his plan was to just further muddy the waters by having Dumbledore's Order member's son know the killing curse. Rita Skeeter would have been able to make a lot of insinuations from that fact solely, let alone that the target of the curse was Dumbledore, their beloved leader. A falling out because of the betrayal of their leader, then using the skills taught by the Dark Lord to enact revenge against him? It would have been a story worthy of daytime T.V. Still, it was a bit too hard to accept that the most powerful wizard of this age had been killed by an idiot that was barely passing magical school for kids. As a few cries of "unforgivable" were shouted out in shock and fear, more and more people in the crowded arena focused once again on the battlefield. What they saw was an old man lying unresponsive on the ground, a shrieking harpy, and a horrified red-headed boy still pointing his battered wand at the lifeless old man. As if finally realizing what he had done and the consequences that would soon follow, Ron dropped his wand as if it was a slimy snake that he hated so much. He then mounted a brilliant legal defense that would surely get him off the hook from any punishment. "It wasn't my fault." Chad couldn't help but snort in derision. Even so far away, he had nevertheless managed to barely catch what Ron had shouted out in denial. Still, he couldn't really blame the boy. Killing someone for the first time was bound to leave a person rattled. It didn't help matters for the youngest Weasley male that he had little control over his previous actions. After all, it was Chad that had used legilimency to focus the boy's notorious temper at Dumbledore and trigger the use of the killing curse. How else would Ron know how to cast it otherwise? The Aurors that had been earlier making the battlefield safe took out their wands and started to converge on Ronald while shouting orders for him to put his hands up and surrender quietly. But considering that he had already dropped his wand, it was clear he wasn't planning to go out in a blaze of glory. However, before anyone could get close enough to arrest him, a black formless mass of energy with a human-like face screamed its way out of Dumbledore's corpse. The Aurors that had their wands out reflexively shot out stunners at the corrupted soul, but the spells did nothing to it, merely passing through it and managing to hit a few members of the gathered Weasley family. Those of the red-headed family still conscious started screaming. They were already in shock at watching their hero Dumbledore killed by one of their own, and this new development was just too much. Ron, now wishing he still held his wand, shrieked in fear as the vengeful spirit of Albus Dumbledore flew at him. Just like what happened to Harry Potter when he killed Quirrell in canon, Ron was blasted off his feet and into unconsciousness when the disembodied soul passed through him and flew off into the sky. Before Chad could do anything to stop his most dangerous foe from getting away, the world froze. The sound of clapping hands drew his attention. Turning, he saw an old man with long white hair and beard and dressed in flowing white robes. The man was the picture of a stereotypical wise, caring grandfatherly god, full of warmth and nothing but concern for his faithful followers. R.O.B. Who else was capable of such feats of magic as to freeze the entire world while leaving some untouched by it? He had created it after all, or at least powered the phenomenon of it splitting/duplicating from the original Harry Potter universe. Good work, my boy, but what took you so long? Things were getting boring watching you bumble around building up organizations and playing magical dictator. The omnipotent being drawled out after he stopped slow clapping. Chad looked at the omnipotent being with a healthy dose of fear and suspicion, the loving grandfather act having long ago been dispelled by both Dumbledore and this god's actions. Still, with a hint of excitement, Chad suddenly remembered R.O.B's last words to him when he was thrust into this universe. "When you die, if you do a good job, I will grant you a single reasonable wish." But he was confused at R.O.B's sudden appearance. It was way too early for his reward. Chad could only question the man. "What do you mean took too long?" "You said, when you die, meaning that this was my new life. Of course I was going to set myself up in a position of power to live out my days after getting rid of Dumbledore. Only an idiot doesn't plan for the future." "Oh, I did say that, didn't I? Well, I'm not going to sit around and watch some slice of life bullsh***, that would be way too boring. No, it's time for your next jump." The god with unlimited power cheerfully informed his entertainment. "What do you mean jump?" Chad asked with trepidation. The buzzword, jump, could only mean he was now involved in a jump chain. Would he now have to continue jumping through hoops for eternity? Though it wouldn't be without a lot of fun and benefits, no free will would severely put a damper on things. Surely you have read those web novels that describe a chosen plebeian traveling the multiverse for our amusement? Congratulations, now you have joined their ranks as a member. R.O.B replied gleefully. But I didn't get a warehouse or even any choice points to spend. And what about my wish? Well, we can start that stuff now, I guess. But your next jump has already been decided. I want to see some medieval warfare and drama. You are off to Planetos. You must be joking, why would I want to go to the Game of Thrones world, no internet, dental hygiene, or even toilet paper? Also, you do know that Planetos is not that world's real name, right? Oh, what is it then? Yeah, that's what I thought. Here, have a look at the CYOA document and choose your skills and stuff. Chad could only sigh. Game of Thrones would not be even in his top 20 places to visit if he had any choice about it. Well, I suppose magic should overcome any of the inconvenience of living in the Iron Age. Good thing I know a few cleaning spells, Chad said, trying to psych himself up for his new situation. Yeah. Hate to burst your bubble, but you are not keeping your magic. Only your CYOA choices will be in effect. R.O.B said with a malicious smile. Oh, in that case, I will take my wish now and end our contract. You can stick living in a world where the slightest cut might kill you from infection or where bathing is considered a luxury right up your arse. Chad said with conviction, no way in hell was he down for that. He might as well continue living here where he was on track to rule the world and had magic. Sweet, sweet magic that made the impossible possible. Giving that up to become a vanilla mortal while facing dragons and the Night King? Yeah. No thanks. Hey come on, don't be such a pansy. Haven't you watched the show? There is no magic on that world until the dragons come back when Daenerys births her dragons. And even then it is not strong. Don't give me that sh*t. Putting aside that jump chains let you keep your previous powers, I suppose a 300-mile ice wall that never melts, a literal horde of magical ice zombies, children of the forest destroying or flooding massive tracts of land, Melisandre throwing fire around while not looking like a granny, shadowbinders, faceless men, wargs, greenseers, warlocks. Okay, fine, you have made your point. But it will be way too boring if I don't nerf you. The majority of Planetos is ignorant of magic, and you teleporting around while brainwashing everyone would be like watching paint dry. Well, yeah, but why would I want to give up all of my advantages and seriously increase my chance of death? But if it makes you feel better, you can just limit me to only magic that has been used in that world. I'm sure it will be exciting for you to watch me use the Children of the Forest's magic to just blow up everything north of the wall. Okay, you can keep your magic, but not all of it. No mind magic, contracts, teleportation, large-scale offensive magic. How about we limit it to the Harry Dresden world's magic rules, and only use magical contracts that are completely transparent? Chad interrupted, if he had to be nerfed, then he might as well get all the advantages he could out of it. 1. Thou shalt not kill, with magic. 2. Thou shalt not change another. 3. Thou shalt not invade the mind of another. 4. Thou shalt not enthrall another. 5. Thou shalt not reach beyond the borders of life. 6. Thou shalt not swim against the currents of time. 7. Thou shalt not open the outer gates. This way, he could still take advantage of the versatility of the Potterverse magic. That might work. But still no teleportation or port keys, and no warehouse or body mods like in other jump chains. You can't take massively overpowered technology to another setting where you would destroy all opposition. R.O.B countered, set on making things hard for Chad. Before we skip over the topic, what happens to this world when we leave? Asked Chad, looking around at frozen witches and wizards pointing fearfully at Dumbledore's retreating soul form. Chad had spent most of his time in this lifetime setting things up for his future. To see all of his efforts wasted was too much for him to accept. He hadn't even banged any of his fantasy girls yet, still waiting for them to mature. I'm not going to waste energy protecting this world, it has already served its purpose. Unless you want to use your wish. What followed was a more thorough bargaining session to iron out every detail of their jump chain future together. Since R.O.B chose the next world, Chad would get to keep his magic, but he would need to pick from a list of CYOA/jump documents for all future world selections himself. The rub was that he would not be able to use any pre-existing magic, skills, or talents. He would need to rely on his choices from the documents of his new jump. It was a harsh trade-off, but since he could pick his own destination, it would be easy to gain valuable skills to replace what he lost. However, since things needed to be fair for him to play R.O.B's game, he did get a few benefits from this. Any drawbacks, flaws or complications that dealt with the loss of previous skills or warehouse access could still be taken for extra choice points. Also, any skills or abilities lost would be regained once his jump ended, otherwise, what was the point? However, the main benefit of a written contract was that R.O.B wouldn't be able to just change things as he pleased. He might still be able to out-lawyer Chad, but he would no longer have to fear R.O.B spicing things up in a jump. Chad wasn't sure if cutting a jump early counted, since it still meant he won and gained a new world to add to his future galactic empire. Being able to revisit a world and tie up loose ends took away anything negative from a premature victory caused by R.O.B's boredom. R.O.B had nearly made Chad use his wish solely to retain access to the Potterverse he had just spent years building up, but in the end, he saw the trap and added all conquered worlds to his future interdimensional empire. The problem, though, was R.O.B was a god. Just as Chad felt proud of himself for not wasting his wish, R.O.B asked how he planned to travel between his worlds. But rather than make another deal that would see Chad undoubtedly lose something of value, he decided to just make his third jump to a place that could grant him dimensional travel. With everything agreed upon, Chad's only request from R.O.B was a month to relax before he lost all forms of technology that he has taken for granted. As someone that didn't even like camping, a medieval setting was going to be hell. Also, he needed to kill off Dumbledore before he turned as annoying as Voldemort in canon. If you like this content, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you later, bye bye.